Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Now, one of the most rewarding cars to drive in sim racing, for me at least, is the Porsche Cup car on iRacing. I know it's possibly not the most realistic handling car on iRacing. Real life racing drivers have said as much, but I still get lots of satisfaction from driving it. Probably the same way that I get satisfaction from driving the Lotus 49. That's a similar story. Really difficult car to control, difficult car to stop spinning. But I also get lots of satisfaction from buttering a slice of bread without ripping it to pieces. So what we're going to talk about in this video is the most tricky thing with the Porsche Cup car, and that's getting it stopped. So put your feet up, grab a cup of tea, and let's get on track. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about, and possibly one of the most important things in the Porsche Cup car, is brake bias. Now, if you don't know, brake bias is how much braking is done by the front tyres and how much braking is done by the rear tyres. And in some cars, you can adjust that before the race. And in cars like the Porsche Cup car, well, you can make those adjustments during the race. And in most simulators, brake bias is displayed as a percentage number telling us how much braking is done by the front tyres. So for example, if you had a 50% brake bias, well, that means that 50% is done by the front tyres, therefore 50% is being done by the rear tyres. The higher that number, the more braking is done at the front, but that means you're more likely to lock up because the front tyres are doing most of the braking. So you might say, well, why not throw all the braking to the rear of the car? Then you won't lock up. Well, you won't lock the front tyres, but then you start locking up the rear tyres, or almost locking up the rear tyres. And that causes the car to over-rotate on corner entry when trail braking, and it also introduces diff lock. Now, diff lock occurs when there's no load on the rear wheels. Now, under normal circumstances, so when you're decelerating, the engine's still turning, which is still turning the gearbox, which still turns the prop shaft, which still turns the diff, which still turns the rear wheels. But when you downshift for a millisecond, there is no load on the gearbox, and the brakes take that opportunity to just grab hold of the discs. And that's when you get locking at the rear, which is normally when ABS would kick in. But obviously, the Porsche Cup car doesn't have ABS. So you can't have the braking too far back. So I've brought you here to Monza, and I'm going to show you a couple of practical examples. We're using turn 1, high speed straight, followed by a really heavy braking zone. And I'll show you the importance of having the right brake bias. So I've set up a custom sector. We're on the iRacing setup. I've not made any changes to the brake bias. I'm going to be braking at the 200 meter board just to give us some consistency. So standard brake bias, which is 42.1. You can see that in the bottom left of my relative. So we'll release this button and we'll be on our way. So we're going to brake at the 200 board. There's 300. There's 200. So nice steady braking there. The brake trace wasn't consistent, but nice steady braking. No locking at the front, no locking at the rear. So we'll do the same again, but we'll lower the brake bias by 2% down to 40.1. Now, we shouldn't get any locking at the front, but we might get a little bit of wheel hopping and instability at the rear. So down to 40.1. There we go. We're going to be braking at the 200, so there's 3. So yeah, we got it slowed down and we weren't braking any harder, but the rear wheels did start skipping around. So we'll try that again at the normal brake bias. So exactly the same, 42.1 this time. See if you can see the difference. 200. Nice and stable, no dramas at all. Now this time we'll increase the brake bias to just over 44% and see what that's like. So more braking now is being done at the front, but only 2% more. So we're going to brake at the 200. There's 3, there's 2. No dramas. So let's go to 46 dead. You can see it on the relative. 46, brake at the 200. And I didn't brake any harder. Look at that. So we'll try that again. 46. Look at the bottom left of the relative. You can see the number there. 46. Brake at the 200. Yeah, we're not braking any harder. Just the front tyres are saying, nah. So then you can experiment. So we'll go to 45. Bang on 45 there. See if that's any better. Brake at the 200. Still sliding. It's not liking anything above 44. We'll go to 44. 44.3. Yeah, it's happy there. 44.3. So another really important thing I want to mention with the Porsche Cup car is fuel, and more specifically where the fuel is. Obviously the Porsche Cup car's got the engine at the rear, which means the fuel tank is at the front. So when you've got a full tank of fuel, there's more weight over the front of the car, it's less likely to lock up. But as the fuel burns, the front of the car is lighter, it locks easier. So for qualifying, you might need to knock your brake bias down a couple of clicks, or as the race progresses, just keep knocking it down a click, a couple of clicks every 10 litres. Now, we've talked about brake bias. Get your head around that. Now, the Porsche Cup car is really sensitive to the initial brake application. It doesn't matter how low you have your brake bias. If you're not smooth on the brakes, you're going to lock the tyres. And you can actually brake quite hard in the Porsche Cup car after that initial application. So we can't just jab on the brakes, because if you do, it's just going to lock. We need to transfer the weight of the car to the front. And when we do that, we can then squeeze the pedal just to brake a bit harder. I'll try and demonstrate that now. So stock brake bias, going back down to turn number 1. And if you look at my telemetry, I'm going to be really aggressive with that initial brake application. There we go, straight to 100%, locks up straight away. There's no way that I was going to recover that. We'll do the same again, but I'm just going to be a bit more gentle with that initial application. I'm going to brake really hard still, but just not as aggressive. So you can see I was almost up to 100% initially there braking, but I didn't lock. I'll show you that one more time. So we're going to brake really hard, but we're just not going to stab the brake. So again, really hard braking initially, but then we're just releasing it and getting the weight over the front tyres. Now, I'll show you the importance of being smooth on the brakes. So you know when we're locking up, when we had the brake bias at 45%? Well, we'll try and up it to 45% and just try and be a little bit more controlled with the brake. So brake bias, bottom left of the relative, go to 45%. Look for the 200. I'm just going to try and squeeze that brake. Easy. Try that again. Go up to 46%. Just be nice and smooth with the brake. 200. Didn't lock up. Now let's try and go a little bit higher. 48%. Maybe pushing it a bit too much though. 200. So we just didn't brake as hard. We can see there's not a hint of locking up. Brake there probably up to about 65, 70%. So even though brake bias is really important, how you apply the brakes works hand in hand with your brake bias. The more braking that's done by the front tyres, well, the less you can stamp on the brakes. Now, another thing to keep in mind is the less speed you have in the car, the less downforce you've got, the more you need to come off the brakes. And if you add any kind of steering input, you need to release the brakes at the same time as you start to turn. The more you turn, the less braking you should have. Ideally, what you want to be doing is turning into the apex, and as you turn, releasing the brake. They're both working hand in hand to get the maximum rotation. If you're still hard on the brakes when you start to turn, well, it's just going to understeer, lock the front tyres, and you're off. But if you start to turn and there's too much braking at the rear, well, that's just going to start the rear sliding, and you're going off, but just in a different kind of way. So I'll demonstrate it first of all under normal circumstances. So as we start to turn in, we're going to be coming off the brakes. So brake it just before the bridge, and as we turn in, we're just releasing that brake as we turn into the apex. So we'll try the same again, but this time we'll try and carry a little bit more brake into the turn, and it should lock up and want to go straight on. There we go. Because we didn't bleed off the brakes, That happened. So now I'll try and demonstrate what happens when the brake bias is a bit too low. Over rotation on corner entries. So we're going down to the parabolica and I'll try and turn in, I'll lower the brake bias and see what happens. So brake bias 40.6. You can see that I wasn't braking particularly hard. So this is what it should look like under normal circumstances. So brake bias 42.6. Dead easy. I'll do it one more time, but we'll increase the brake bias to 45. Locks up. So it's really important to not only have the correct brake bias, but also the correct braking technique. Don't stab at the brakes, because if you stab at the brakes, you're going to lock up instantly, and then it's really difficult to try and recover. You've got to do some cadence braking, trying to create your own ABS. So smooth application initially, then you can squeeze the pedal. As the speed decreases and you start to turn in, well, that's when you need to start bleeding off the brakes to match up with your steering input. Ideally, maximum steering input at the apex and just a tiny bit of brake. If in doubt, always brake a tiny bit earlier than you need to, and just brake with a little bit less pressure. As we're seeing going into turn one, you can brake in the same distance, you just can't brake as hard. It's all about technique. But give it a whirl, set up some custom sectors at Monza, just experiment with the brake bias and the difference going up and down makes to how the car wants to stop. That's the most challenging thing with the Porsche Cup car, is getting it stopped in the first place. But let me know down below in the comments how you get on. Hopefully this helps. Thanks for watching. Have a great week. See you later. Cheers.